Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Contact. Okay, kind of a big compositional step lined up for the moment. I want aspen-ish leaves coming off of, well, we're going to start right here with this little branch. And then they'll be going in a very symmetrical scale-like pattern, going through all of the seasons as far as the tone of the color on the final application. But to start, I need to pattern in line work for all the leaves, scale leaves that will be going back to about right here. So through here, through up there to about right here. Will be these aspen leaves slash scales that will be going from bright green into gold into tannish brown winterish grays, and then that's probably as far as we're going to get right now on this. So here we go.
Furthermore, a study in the United States last year showed that the more episodes of racism a black woman experiences in your country, the greater her risk of asthma. What's going on here? What's going on here is that people's emotional states have a huge impact on their physiology. And that's obvious because I could change your physiology, I could change everybody's physiology in here in one split second. All I'd have to do is to take out a weapon and to scream at you. And your physiology would change without me having touched you. Why? Because you would have experienced fear. The alarm center in your brain, the amygdala, would have gone off like a danger signal, which would have then recruited other centers in the brain, and your body would mobilize hormones and muscle and nerve and cardiovascular reactions to deal with the threat. In other words, the emotion of fear would have changed your body in a split second. I'll be telling you this afternoon that the interaction between emotions and physiology is 24/7, whether we're aware of it or not. But that means to say that we can't separate the mind from the body. And then to understand any physiological process, virtually any physiological process in the body, you have to understand not just the physical aspects of it, but also the emotional environment in which it takes place. That's the first point. The second point is, so that people are biopsychological creatures, so biology cannot be separated from our psychology. But if you look at the stressed parents, why are they stressed? Because they're unemployed? Because their communities are falling apart? Because their marriage might be in trouble? Why do people experience racism? Because they live in a society that has yet to deal with that particular human problem. So we're not just psycho-biological creatures, we're biopsychosocial creatures. In other words, our biology is significantly affected by the emotional environment, which exists in a cultural social environment. You simply cannot separate people's physiology, including their brain physiology, and including the circuits of the brain that are implicated in addiction from the psychological, emotional, and social environment. You cannot do that, not in real life. So that unity, that interactivity with human beings is what's missing from the conversation. That's what's missing from the conversation. Well, let's put it back in the conversation and see what we find. And incidentally, what I'm telling you here is not a theory. Right? It's not purely a theory. It's the only one that's scientifically tenable. I'm talking about proven science. So my problem with this whole addiction discussion, especially in my own profession, the medical profession, is we keep talking about evidence-based practice. Pretty good. Okay. Well, I only wish that we had evidence-based practice. Because all the evidence points to a biopsychosocial perspective on human beings, and particularly on the problem of addiction. So let's go through a few layers. Let's peel back the layers of addiction. In the 1990s, when I was in my 50s, I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD.
Looking a little like eyes.
And my first book on the subject, which I'll talk
It'd be
about
fun
later.
to run with that. And instead of doing the leaf color,
on the back of your brochures, my books are listed.
seasonal changes, do the eye color as
The
seasonal
books that are for
changes.
sale outside are the American
I might do that.
titles and
We'll
covers,
see.
which sometimes look the same, but most of them they do not, because American publishers always think they know better. So they take a best-selling book in Canada and then they publish it with a different title. Don't ask. Actually, I'll tell you, my book on ADHD in Canada was entitled Scattered Minds. The American publisher brought it out as scattered, thinking that the American public won't understand the word minds. Only 3 years later to bring out a book called Scattered Minds on the same subject, just to confuse things. Anyway, I was diagnosed with the condition in my 50s, in my mid-50s, and I was given Ritalin and Dexedrine. You know, these are stimulant medications. They elevate the levels of a chemical called dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is a motivation chemical. So when you're more motivated, you pay attention. Your mind will be all over the place. So we elevate dopamine levels with the stimulant drugs like Ritalin, Adderall, Dexedrine, and so on. I'll tell you more about dopamine in a few minutes. But what else elevates dopamine levels? Well, all the stimulants do. What are the stimulants? Cocaine, crystal meth, caffeine, nicotine. Which is to say that a significant minority of people that are used stimulants, illicit stimulants, you know what they're actually doing? They're self-medicating their ADHD. So I'm proposing to you that on one level, and we have to go deeper than that, but on one level, addictions are about self-medications. So if you look at alcoholics, in one study, 40% of male adult alcoholics met the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. Why? Because alcohol soothes the hyperactive brain. Cannabis does the same thing. And in studies of stimulant addicts, about 30% had ADHD prior to the drug use. But what else do people self-medicate? Well, somebody mentioned depression. So if you've been treated for depression, as I have been, you were given an SSRI medication, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, and so on. These medications elevate the level of another brain chemical called serotonin, which is implicated in mood regulation. What else elevates serotonin levels temporarily in the brain? Cocaine does. People use cocaine to self-medicate depression. People use alcohol and cannabis and opiates to self-medicate anxiety. Incidentally, people also use gambling or shopping to self-medicate because these activities also elevate dopamine levels in the brain. So one of the messages I'll be giving you is that there ain't no difference between one addiction and the other. They're just different targets, but the brain systems that are involved.
Simplify things, I'm just going straight through the branches. I'll go back and reinforce the branches and connect them into the corners of what would probably be eyes now, as I progress with the rest of the painting.
So people self-medicate anxiety, depression.
For now, just the shape of the
People
leaf
self-medicate
pattern
bipolar.
into the scale eye.
Saliently with alcohol.
Dealing things is going to be complex
People
enough to
self-medicate
where I don't know
post-traumatic
about
stress
with
disorder.
loading branches.
When your veterans or ours come back from Afghanistan or the Middle East and they become opiate addicts, they're actually very often self-medicating post-traumatic stress disorder because it soothes the symptoms temporarily. So one way to understand addictions is that there's self-medications. That's important to understand because if you're working with people who are addicted, it's really important to know what's going on in their lives and what else they're, why they're doing this. So apart from the level of comfort and pain relief, there's usually something diagnosable that's there at the same time. And you have to pay attention to that. At least you have to talk about it. You may need to treat it. So that's on one level. But let's go deeper. So I mentioned the opiates, which are derived from the opium plant, which comes from Afghanistan, where the production of opium has reached unprecedentedly high levels. I will refrain from making political comments, but that's what's going on, people. More opium is being produced now than ever before, and hitting the international markets. And opiates have been used for thousands of years. They're the most powerful pain medications that we have. So Chinese medicine knew about opium back 2,000 years ago at least, maybe even before. So thank God for the opiates. When I was working in palliative care, I could be grateful every day because without the opiates, high doses of them, people would die in agony. But with the opiates, we can make them very comfortable. By the way, let me shatter a myth around addiction. This whole idea that drugs are addictive, they're not in themselves addictive. I gave high quantities of opiates to people when I needed to with terminal illness. But then if you found another way, let's say somebody had severe back pain, which is a tumor deposit in their spine. So they needed sometimes, 1,000, 2,000 milligrams of morphine a day. That's a huge amount. 5 milligrams every 4 hours is what you get if you break your leg. 30 milligrams a day. I was giving multiples of that number. But then if you give that person a nerve block and the pain goes away, very quickly we get them off their opiates and they were not addicted to it. And large-scale studies have shown that a lot of people can be given opiates for pain and they don't become addicted. Which means that the drugs in themselves are not addictive, are they? Now, let me ask you a question. Is alcohol addictive? Raise your hand if you think it is. Is alcohol addictive? Yeah? I know you're hesitating, right? Because well, it's not addictive, obviously, because raise your hand if you ever had a glass of wine in your life, or beer, okay? Now keep your hand up if you had an alcohol problem in your life. Well, if it was addictive, you should all be alcohol addicts. In other words, no drug, no substance in itself is addictive. Most people who try most substances, even repeatedly, never become addicted to it. So you can talk about these highly addictive drugs like crack and crystal meth and all that. The vast majority of people who try them never become addicted. So what we have to actually, so when asked the question, is alcohol addictive, yes or no? You know what the answer is? Yes or no. That's what the answer is. When asked, is shopping addictive?
Just realized
yes
I may
no?
have been standing in front of my line work the entire process. If that wasn't too bad. Alright, since I'm going to be working further to the left now, I want to move the camera a little bit and hopefully correct that if that was the case.
Because the substance itself doesn't explain it, and therefore, to put the emphasis on simply trying to stop the flow of drugs, as if that's ever made any difference whatsoever, is by definition to waste a lot of resources and to create a lot of unnecessary pain. That's not where the answer is. So, the opiates, pain relief. But here's what you have to understand. They don't only relieve physical pain, they also relieve emotional pain. It turns out that the same part of the brain that experiences the suffering of physical pain also experiences the suffering of social rejection, for example. The sources and pathways of the pain are different, but the suffering is experienced in the same part of the brain where opiate receptors are abundantly present. And if you look at alcohol, it's a pain reliever. In fact, the old saying, when somebody drank too much, they used to say, he's feeling no pain. Cocaine is a local anesthetic, it numbs nerve endings. Cannabis has pain relieving qualities, as we are beginning to find out. All the behaviors of addiction, whether they're substance related or not, either directly soothe pain, emotional pain, or they distract from it. So my mantra, and if there's nothing else you remember from the day, is simply this. The first question in addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And if you want to understand why people have pain, you've got to look at their lives, not at their genes, not at their choices, or what actually happened to them. Well, why is it that the opiates even work in the human brain? I mean, it's a plant. Opium grows in Asia. Why is it so effective in our bodies, in our brains? Well, for the simple reason, as many of you know, that we have receptors for them. The receptors are molecules on the surfaces of our cells that can receive a messenger molecule. So hormones are messenger molecules, opiates are messenger molecules, cocaine is a messenger molecule, and for the messenger to work, there has to be somebody to receive the message. You know, it's like you send a message out there, but there's no receiver, nobody's going to hear it. Well, we have receptors for tens of thousands of substances on every cell in our body, in the cell membrane. Tens of thousands of receptors, including we have opiate receptors. Now, why do we have receptors for a plant product that comes from Asia? Well, of course, as again many of you know, the answer is that we don't. But we have receptors for our own endogenous opiate-like substances, which are called endorphins. And endorphin simply means endogenous morphine-like substance. So the question is, so we have an endorphin system. Why do we have an endorphin system? Just so that we can get high on a Saturday night? Surely not. So nature is very efficient that way. It'll use the same substance for many different purposes. And so the endorphin system has many different roles. For example, if you have traveler's diarrhea, you're going to get an opiate because it slows the bowel down. Because the bowel has, the intestines have opiate receptors, which help to modulate the motility of the bowel. If you go through opiate withdrawal, you'll have diarrhea for the same reason. So the opiates are active throughout the system, and they have multiple different roles. But in the brain, they have three major functions, which are crucial to understanding addictions. First, they relieve pain, physical and emotional pain. That's obvious, we've already talked about it. Pain, of course, is important in life because without pain, you just can't function. But also with too much pain, we can also not function. So we have to have pain relief. That's their first role. Their second role is that euphoria that you mentioned, that sense of pleasure and reward. It's the endorphins in abundance that give us that euphoric state, pleasure and a sense of reward. That's their second function. Their third function is the most important, the least appreciated. They actually make possible a dynamic without which human life is actually impossible. They are attachment chemicals. By attachment chemicals, I mean attachment between two human beings. Attachment is the drive to be close to somebody for the purpose of being taken care of, or for the purpose of taking care of the other. That's the fundamental role of attachment. It's not the only role, but it's the fundamental one. The reason it's the fundamental one is the human infant is the most helpless, the most dependent, the least mature, the most vulnerable of any creature in the universe, and stays that way for the longest period of time compared to any other animal. So attachment relationships are actually the key dynamic in human life. Without attachment, there just is no life. Infant mice in the laboratory, when their endorphin receptors are knocked out genetically, so there's no endorphin activity, will not cry for their mothers on separation. Now, what would that mean in the wild state? It would mean their death. If they're isolated from mother and they don't call for mom, they're dead. So the endorphins are actually necessary for the very basic nurturing relationships in human life. Now, consider for a moment a human being who, for reasons we'll look at, comes to the conclusion, implicit conclusion, that without this particular chemical, I will not have a sense of pain relief, pleasure, reward, or connection.
Let's get the endorphins working. Hold
How are you
on.
going to take that away from them? You're going to put a sign on the wall? Just say no. Just say no to pain relief. Say no to pleasure and reward. Say no to a sense of belonging and connection. A sex trade worker in Vancouver told me that the first time she did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. She was encapsulating the biophysiology of addiction in that one sentence. That's the opiates. I mentioned the stimulants. The stimulants elevate dopamine levels. By the way, it's not like the opiates only elevate dopamine levels, or only elevate endorphin levels. All the substances and all the behaviors of addiction go through the pleasure pathways, the pain relief pathways. They also go through the dopamine pathways.
So line work
you must have
that
seen
to
a
start.
strict
Polish it up a little bit. Maybe go back reinforce the
divisions.
trunk in a second session.
I'm talking about the predominant effect, but really all behaviors of addiction engage the same brain circuits as well, without any external substances. And all substances will trigger the dopamine and the endorphin and so on.
Even
But the
pattern will
stimulants
lose.
primarily most directly elevate dopamine levels. Now dopamine is another crucial brain chemical without which life is not possible. Because dopamine is the incentive motivation chemical.
Right along the K.
So that flow of
We'll feed you
dopamine,
in just a
we're
minute,
inert,
baby. We'll take a
inactive,
break and feed you
lifeless,
after this.
unmotivated,
We'll
which
take
means we don't
a
live.
second mix-ups.
So dopamine flows whenever you're exploring a
Ranch
novel object or a
coloration.
novel environment. Now think of the importance of dopamine in human evolution.
Come back and reinforce
Explore
our
novel objects,
please
novel
there.
environments. Look at
And
children.
then I think I
when
will
they
turn
begin
these
life.
eyes.
They're full of
That'll be fun.
dopamine activity. Exploring novel objects, and, they will put the whole world in their mouths. Novel environments. Dopamine flows when you're seeking food. Dopamine flows when you're seeking a sexual partner. So I can use for you. Sex addiction, for example, is not about sex. Is it?
How much time do we got left?
It's about the seeking, isn't it?
6
Because
minutes.
if
I think
it
I
was
can do that.
about sex, all one sex addict would have to do is to find another one and be a partner for the rest of their lives. And I'm not making fun of the condition, it's very serious. But really, if sex was the issue, then sex would be the solution. But it isn't. It's that seeking, it's the hunt, it's the thrill, it's the getting the next one. As soon as you have this one, you need to go on to another one. Like with any addict, any addiction. Because that's where the dopamine comes from. So in my own shopping addiction days, it wasn't the objects that I was looking for. I didn't need any more of them.
What are you doing, baby?
As soon as I had one, I needed
No,
another
Dad,
one.
you
It's
need
not that I
5 minutes,
needed
I'll
another
get you
one.
snacks.
I needed to have the experience of being excited and motivated and alive that the dopamine flow gave me. And I was never a substance addict, but I was a dopamine addict for sure. So imagine a human being then who comes to the conclusion, implicitly, that without this substance, I won't feel alive, motivated, excited, vital. Why are you going to take that away from me?
Right along the K.
Make it illegal, forbidden, talk them out of it. Good luck. Now I mentioned 2 other brain circuits implicated in addiction.
Right along.
One of the traits of
Yeah,
ADHD
baby, 1 minute.
is poor impulse regulation. So that kids with ADHD, they just can't stop themselves from acting out and blurting out. Or adults, myself, like whatever you want,
She
you have
knows
to
the
do it right
cameras
away,
on. She's
whether you
acting
need it or
up.
not. So impulse buying and all this. Well, there's a huge link between ADHD and addiction because they both involve dopamine, they both involve poor impulse regulation. And when it comes to addicts in general, they have poor impulse regulation. What is impulse regulation? Impulse regulation is very simple. Let's say I haven't had breakfast this morning, but I see My friend over there has got an apple sitting on the table. And I might feel like going over there and biting into the apple. That's the impulse. Maybe I'll do it. Getting nervous, okay. It's your apple, yeah. Well, there's nothing wrong with the impulse. The problem would be if I acted it out. Because it's not my apple. And I'm in the middle of a talk right now, and you're not sitting here to watch me munch on an apple. So that's okay, because here, right here, and I'm pointing to it, is the orbitofrontal cortex, a part of my brain, who's got many functions. One of them is impulse regulation. So the job of the cortex, of the gray matter, is not so much to initiate impulses, but to stop them. Let's say you're a man, a powerful man, who wants to grab another human being by a certain part of the body.
Okay. I think that's pretty decent.
I mean, guys will admit to having those impulses. But to act them out, that speaks to poor impulse regulation. Typical of ADHD. Typical also of addiction. When you do brain scans on drug addicts, the commonest brain finding is
All right, that works.
abnormality in that part
Kept
of
the
the brain.
pattern a little loose to bend it
So somebody
appropriately, but I think I can turn all of those little shapes. If you couldn't hear my muttering while I was talking at the canvases, I'm going to turn all of the scales into eyes, and rather than do a color transition for the seasons across the coloration of the leaf scales, I think I'll keep the iris color varying, going from bright green into grays, browns and grays, like that. And maybe vary them a little bit more. But that'll take a little bit longer to do, but it should be a really fun detail. But that just doubles my work on this, but that's okay. I'm going to take a second take, reinforce the branches after I feed the cat. Take two, coming up. Alright, Meryl Streep is eating her dinner. And before I use, I just mixed up some dark for the trunk, coal black. Soho coal black, and the little limbs. But before I get into that, I am going to reinforce the line work that I just did a little bit. So I think I'm going to raise that
By
up,
the way,
zoom it in,
if I speak with some heat about these issues,
about right there.
it's not because I'm critical
That's what we're really working
in your
on.
country or any other country. It's because when we know so much, when the evidence is in, when the science is clear, it is challenging to deal with a system that completely ignores human experience and human science,
Oh shit.
and doesn't even debate these issues significantly. And even the Surgeon General's report
What did I do with my brush?
completely missed
Oh shit.
the long-established science of brain development.
Okay, did you take my brush?
Astonishment.
What did you do with it?
What I'm telling you here is not taught in any of the medical schools. And it's not even controversial.
Oh crap.
It's just that it's
Sorry
a
folks,
swath
I'm
of
not going to
evidence
hit
that we
stop while I
need.
find it.
So the next
I have
paragraph.
to find it.
The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the
That
circuit of the
is
developing brain
probably it.
and is critically influenced by, so it's not genes, it's the interaction of genes and experiences. Genes are turned on and off by the environment. You can have two people with the same genes behave totally differently depending on whether those genes were turned on or off by the environment. Genes don't determine human behavior. They predispose what they don't determine. You can have children, this has been shown in the States in studies, that children who may have certain genes that might predispose to addiction, if they're brought up in a good environment, the risk of addiction is no greater than that of other kids. Animals, the same thing. Genes don't determine addiction. It's complete nonsense, scientifically. And if you want to talk to me about that, if you have any questions, I'll explain more about it. But I'm trying to assert for your matter that the assumptions that underlie the genetic studies on addiction are so transparently shallow. You have to wonder, why is it that we keep clinging to that hypothesis? Why do we keep clinging to that hypothesis? Because it allows us not to look at society and family life and our own histories. That's why we keep clinging to those theories. I'm not getting to this paragraph, am I? The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuit of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. In other words, the key influence on the development of all these crucial brain circuits is what? The quality of parent-child relationships. I'm not talking about whether parents love their kids or not. It's not the issue. I'm talking about what is the state of mind of the parent. Is the parent able to be responsive to the child? Or is the parent too stressed because of their own trauma or social issues or economics or whatever it is? Are they too depressed, anxious, distracted? Their lifestyle, is it so harried and busy? These are the issues that define whether parents can be responsive to the child. And if they can't, that will have a negative impact on the brain development because that interaction literally shapes the physiology of the brain. You know what I said? We're biopsychosocial creatures. Our brain development is determined by our emotional environment. Now what do we find when we look at drug addicts? Specifically drug addicts, but any addict actually. Well, in the downtown east side of Vancouver, in 12 years of work, having dealt with hundreds of addicted people, I never met a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. If you work with addictions, hardcore addicts who are female, those who have not been sexually abused will be a minority. And sexual abuse shows up in how the brain looks 15, 20 years later. All the men I had dealt with in the downtown east side had been abused sexually or in other ways. A minority sexually, but in other ways for sure. That was my particular experience and observation. That would also be anybody's experience and observation if you ask the right questions. But we're not even trained to ask these questions. And it's astonishing to me how many addiction specialists never ask about any death or what happened to you in childhood. It just doesn't come up. And yet these are the factors that shape the personality in the brain. Now if you look at the large-scale studies, so I'll answer your question now. Raise your hand if you're familiar with, not just have heard about, but are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, the ACE studies. Okay, so we got about, do we have a fifth of the people here? Fifth or a quarter? Okay, good, thank you. Which, and you must hear this not as any kind of a criticism of you personally. It's an instant photograph of the system. Here I'm talking to an audience of people who work with addictions, who are committed to helping addicts, or who may have your own issues yourselves, and you've never heard of the most important studies ever done. But that's the nature of the system. These studies were done in California. Adverse childhood experiences studies, ACE. For God's sakes, look them up this evening. An adverse childhood experience is physical, sexual,
zoom back a little bit.
Violence in the family, a parent dying, a parent addicted, a parent being addicted, a parent being mentally ill, a parent being jailed, neglect, a divorce.
And drop the
For each of these adverse childhood experiences, the risk
limb
of addiction
color into
goes
the
up
trunk a little bit,
exponentially. They
give it a little
multiply
more
each other.
texture.
So that by the time a male child has the 6 of them, his risk of becoming an injection-dependent substance addict is 4,600% greater than that of a child with no such experiences, a 46-fold increase. Why? A, these experiences interfere with the property law of the brain. Obviously.
Okay.
B,
Oh, and for anyone interested in the background there, that is Gabor Mate's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts lecture, a 4-hour lecture. It's titled as Voices on my Gabor Mate playlist on my YouTube channel.
the title of my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. The hungry ghosts are, it's a Buddhist image of these creatures that have large empty bellies and small mouths and narrow gullets, and they can never fill themselves. They have to keep trying to get something from the outside, but they can never feel fulfilled. That's the addict. That sense of emptiness comes out of a childhood experience where emotionally you weren't satiated when you needed to be. When you have negative experiences as a child, there's a deep sense of shame. If you're sexually abused or otherwise abused, or just not paid attention to the way you needed to be, you're going to feel ashamed of yourself. Why? Because the child can only assume that there's something wrong with him or her. Children are narcissists. And I don't mean in a negative way, I'm just describing a reality. In a sense, they really believe fundamentally that it's all about them. So when something goes wrong, the assumption the child makes is that it's something wrong with me. So hence the shame. There's a deep shame in addicts long before they were addicted. That shame is core. When you're treated that way early in life, you know, the Buddha said that with our minds we create the world, which is true. The way you see the world is how you're going to act in the world. If you see the world as a benign place where, you know, you can expect respect and human contact, you're going to be one way. If you believe that the world is a horrible place, you're going to act another way. And you're going to live in a world then based on that assumption. A man who said that the world is a horrible place is not the President of the United States. Because he had a horrible childhood. His father was a raging workaholic. His brother died of alcoholism. And this man learned that the world is a dangerous place. And that's where he's coming from. I'm not talking about politics here. I'm not talking about policies. You can agree or not agree with any political platform or any perspective or policy. I'm certainly not in a position to, well I am, but I'm not going to comment on any of that. I'm talking about how the personality is formed and how it shows up in the world. And if you think that caregivers who are supposed to look after you don't, then what's going to be your attitude towards caregivers later on? One of suspicion and distrust. Why should it be any other way? So these are the impacts of trauma. I'm going to finish here by saying that I'm not saying that everybody who was traumatized becomes an addict. That's not true. But I am saying that everybody who's addicted was traumatized. If we understand that trauma does not have to be overt, so there's the big T trauma, such as these abuses that I mentioned, and statistically they're highly present in the addicted population, particularly in the substance-addicted population, but also in sex addiction. Most women who are sex addicts were sexually abused as children. Many people with eating disorders were sexually abused as children. But it doesn't have to be that, you see, because as the great British psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott pointed out, two things can go wrong in childhood. One is when things happen that shouldn't happen. But the other is when things don't happen that should happen. My children were not abused. Not that I was free of rage or acting out behaviors, but there's certainly no abuse in any meaningful sense of the word. But what was lacking is that responsiveness. Because I was a workaholic. And why was I a workaholic? Because in my infancy, as a Jewish infant under the Nazis in Hungary in 1944, I got the message that I wasn't wanted. Because under those conditions, my mother was so unhappy and stressed. I don't have to tell you the family history. You can imagine. When the mother is unhappy and stressed, the infant believes she doesn't want me. If she did, she'd be happy. And then, when I'm a year old, 72 years ago now, this month, she gave me to a total stranger in the street to save my life, thinking that she might not live. The message I got is I wasn't wanted. But if you're not wanted, a great way to deal with the sense of not being wanted is to go to medical school. Because it's not they're going to want you all the time. Except they're not going to want you. It's never satiating. Why is it not satiating? Because we have to be wanted for who we are, not for what we do. If we're only wanted for what we do, there's a nagging sense if they really knew who I was, we don't really care about that. They just want what I can give them. But it's the next best thing. So if I can get wanted by going to bed with a lot of people, then that's what I'll do. Even though it doesn't satisfy that core need to be wanted, because that needs to be for the self, not for the body. So, hence the workaholism. At the time the beaker went, it was the validation that I was wanted, but of course it would never satiate. What message do my kids get when daddy's not around all the time? This is how we pass it on from one generation to the next. So it does not take overt trauma, but it does take emotional loss and pain and childhood.
It works.
So for all these reasons, psychological and neurobiological.
Well, I think it's the limbs back in front of the eye leaf scales now, and sets it up for the next step. It also gives a very nice variant in the darkness to the bark of the tree in the lower portion. If I can turn the tree up enough to make that visible without washing the rest of it out.
The Aboriginal people.
Something like that. That's better. Alright, hold on a second. Let me wash my brush out, and I'll hold the camera back, and hopefully I wasn't in front of it the entire time.
It's not accidental. These are people that had substances here in North America, but they were never addicted. They were never addicted before the coming of the Caucasian and the trauma that we felt. In short, addiction is not a choice. It's not a genetic disease. And in some level, even though it acts like a disease, and it's useful to think of it that way, fundamentally, it's not a disease at all. It's a complex response. In fact, it's a very normal response to abnormal circumstances. And if we're going to help addicts, we have to get at the core of their pain and help them deal with it in different ways. That's what I was going to tell you in my introduction. So now there's lots of time. There's about half an hour for questions. Is that right? Correct? Yeah, half an hour.
Adjusted the lamp a little bit so it's a little bit more even light across the surface of this now when I hold the camera back.
So all I have to do is raise your
You
hand.
can kind of see the variation in the clouds now. It's pretty washed out, the photographs from yesterday's session on this painting. But for the moment, that gets a pretty interesting pattern started for the leaf work. And also lends a pretty nice
How prevalent is
texture and tone variation to the lower portion of the tree.
ADHD in the incarcerated population who are also suffering from addiction?
Well,
So as you can see, it's pretty loose right now. But each of those leaf patterns will turn into an eye with varying iris color, tapering from bright green in this area to gray, brownish in this area. So that's going to take quite a bit of time, but it's okay. I'm kind of digging into this painting. So that's it for the moment, though. Back up one more step if I can without hitting nurture. There we go. Alright, well thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting contact. And that is Gabor Mate's Voices is titled on my Gabor Mate playlist on my YouTube channel, and In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts for the video footage, also found on YouTube. Have a good night, Earth.